Excellent.
One of the
So my presentation will be quite brief. Forgive that I was slightly late, but generally I will quickly dive into it. The topic of due diligence and deal structuring. As has been said, I'm head of legal for Founders Factory Africa. We're one of the leading early stage investors in African technology startups. And we primarily focus on sectors including fintech, health tech, and agri-tech, but we're quite sector agnostic, and we also have investments in logistics related businesses. So till date, we've invested in over 50 early stage businesses in Africa, of which we generally invest at the pre-seed stage, namely where businesses have just about gotten some minimal viable product and MVP, and are just starting to potentially show traction, which is where we sort of come in with investment in the form of cash and also in the form of support services to help these businesses get through that stage of getting product market fit, so that then they're in a position to go on and raise priced seed or Series A funding from other institutional investors. So I thought to give that context because it's from that lens generally that I in my day-to-day get to see a lot of how Diligence works in terms of early stage investments in technology in Africa, and also generally how the deals are structured at the earliest stages. Now, I'm sure a lot of us or all of us on this call, being experienced industry people in various capacities, will be aware of what due diligence is, but for the sake of an introduction, we'll start with it. And the purpose of diligence is to obtain as much information on a transaction or investment as possible. Like I always like to say when I discuss diligence, it relates to an old, almost 500-year-old principle stemming from English law, where there's a principle called caveat emptor, and it means buyer beware. And in that regard, since that period when an investor under the laws in most jurisdictions, particularly common law jurisdictions, the onus is for investors or a buyer to show that they have at least done a reasonable amount of diligence to ascertain that what they're actually paying for is what they're getting. Without such an evidence of such, it's quite difficult for buyers and investors sometimes to be able to enforce these things. So that is the key purpose of diligence. But aside those legal reasons, it's also just generally for good governance purposes. As I said, so it's important to know who you're doing business with, especially in the case of when disputes may arise. And generally these days, for a lot of compliance reasons, for investors and limited partners, investors in funds, they all have these sorts of requirements as a minimum based on their regulatory position or the exemptions they've gotten to be able to operate. Anti-money laundering and know your customer regulatory requirements are now part and parcel of doing business, including investment transactions in many countries. And of course, they're primarily to prevent fraud and money laundering, as well as terrorism financing. If you layer on top of that as well, that the fact that particularly a number of African countries have been grey listed by international authorities, such as the Financial Action Task Force, this has also meant that additional diligence is required to be done where investors are looking to make investments in those countries, as well as from funds and fund managers who are looking to raise funds from investors in those countries also. A recent example is the grey listing of South Africa, which has resulted in a lot more frictions in terms of capital controls for investors making investments and looking to repatriate proceeds from investments in South Africa as a result of that. I have a particularly unique view because Founders Factory Africa is headquartered in South Africa, and so I do get to see up close some of the challenges that can be faced as a result of these issues. But the general principle is that where you have the layer of additional grey listing of countries, it just simply means that the diligence requirements are that much more. So I'd like to split diligence requirements into two sides. There's the customer side, for example, with the businesses that investments might be made in themselves. It's important that those businesses do some basic diligence on their customers. And these generally follow simple KYC principles. by gathering some basic information about whoever the customer is. But it's also important for investors to make sure that their target investment companies also put in place procedures and mechanisms and frameworks regarding how they protect the data they get from their customers, given that most African countries now also have quite stringent data protection laws, and these sorts of things add potential risks to investments if they're not considered and actually addressed at the earliest stages. So that's on the customer side for target businesses for investments. For investors themselves, it's also very important that fund managers and others that actually provide investment related services do a lot of key diligence on their investors, particularly on the identity of the investors. And if the investors are corporate entities, it's important to do thorough diligence to ascertain the ultimate beneficial owners, UBO, so to speak, which is something that's increasingly becoming part of the international framework for due diligence. Another key thing about the investor side is to do the diligence on the source of the income of the investor. It's one thing to know the identity, but really the purpose of diligence requirements in relation to anti-money laundering and other sorts of regulatory required diligence is to really make sure that the source of funds involved in any transaction, there's an adequate documented trail as to where it's from, and to make sure it's not from illicit sources, including from politically exposed participants. So generally, that's the overview on diligence. And as I said, I'm sure we're all quite familiar with this and having been part of transactions over the years. But moving on now to deal structuring, again, because of the area that Founders Factory, who I work for and advise, works in, my view of deal structuring will come from the lens of early stage investments rather than later stage Series B, C, and upwards. And in that regard, what we find with deal structuring is that the difficulties with ascertaining valuations with early stage businesses, startups in Africa, particularly those in technology, has led to the proliferation of the use of investment instruments that sort of defer and delay the question of valuation to a later date in the future. These instruments, they're generally called convertible securities, and the principle is that the investor is able to give money to a business now after doing its diligence, of course, as in light of what we just said, but that the fact that the instrument itself will convert into shares at some point in the future, which is usually when the company then raises a priced investment round whereby they actually agree a valuation on the company with third-party investors. So in principle, that's generally how deals are structured at the earliest stages. We found that despite this, there are still some challenges with how investments are structured, because the instruments that I've mentioned, these convertible securities, they were borrowed from more advanced economies and ecosystems, particularly Silicon Valley. And what we find is that because early stage African businesses have a much longer time period from which they're at concept and design stage to when they actually get product market fit and are about to scale, which is around the time where most businesses are usually able to raise priced round investments. We find that the lag time is much longer than it has been traditionally for startups in Silicon Valley. And there are a number of reasons for that, primarily of which are the well-documented infrastructure deficits in Africa, which means that there's a lot more that African technology businesses have to do in an offline capacity in order to bring more users into their online networks in order to grow and scale. So that means that there's a longer period it takes for these businesses to be able to get to real product market fit, and it also means a lot more capital is required. And what that's caused is that a lot of founders and startup businesses have been raising a lot of early stage investment, quite a lot indeed, into the millions of dollars on these convertible instruments. And the problem is that at the point that a priced round is raised, some investors are either a bit wary because of the stack of investors on the cap table already, which would result in significant dilution for founders, which investors don't like, because investors like founders to be sufficiently incentivized to carry the business through to its maturest stages. So we find that that's becoming an issue. And also because a lot of founders keep raising convertible securities rather than a priced round investment, the original investors with their own convertible securities never actually get shares in the company, because the triggers that require the conversion of those securities into shares never actually occur. But of course, these are things that we're finding with the increased investment and activity in Africa, and we'll find that there will likely be more unique sorts of unique versions of these standard instruments used in Silicon Valley and in the EU and in the UK to meet more of these unique sorts of scenarios and sets of circumstances we find in Africa, particularly for early stage businesses. So overall, I find that, to quickly sum up, in terms of due diligence and deal structuring with early stage technology investments in Africa, the key thing generally is that a lot more diligence is required. And the irony is that though more diligence is required, given the lack of sort of data infrastructure, it's harder to get information to perform the diligence, particularly without having to go to the actual location where the business is and to actually physically try and meet customers and see how the business works. So diligence costs are a bit more in Africa, but at the same time, it also has a knock-on effect on deal structuring, because of the lack of sufficient information in the diligence process to be able to ascertain accurate valuations. It's led to deals generally being structured along these converting security lines, which have solved problems initially, which is to get money to founders quickly, even though valuations can't be agreed upon. But it has, over the years, we've seen that it's led to other issues, particularly related to investors, early stage investors, not getting the triggers to be able to have their investments convert into equity. I see that over the next few years, these will be addressed. Founders Factory Africa, for one, is looking at ways to sort of modify our standard investment instruments to account for these sorts of peculiarities. But I do think that we have a bright future ahead, and we will be able to develop unique ways of both doing diligence that is acceptable and meets the minimum requirements for investors, but it's not too onerous for founders. And at the same time, we'll be able to structure deals in a way that gives investors all the comfort that they require, but that meet the unique circumstances of the African startup ecosystem, whereby all parties can move forward collaboratively and aligned on incentives. Thank you very much. Sorry it was rather short, but I thought I'd rather get to the point quickly, and I'd love to take any questions or comments.